everybody. Take a seat. You can sit wherever. So I'm really, really privileged to see such a wonderful turnout. And I'm sorry I made you cry already, some of you. Well, something's lost, but something's gained, right? Those magnificent words of Joni Mitchell's, they really are how I came to hold the unimaginable and very paradoxical parts of my story that I'm going to share with you today. They became, in so many ways, the metaphor for my personal journey of grief, healing, and empathy. I married a man who I had grown up with in Connecticut, more or less. His name was Brett, and he was from Fairfield, and I was from Easton, Connecticut. And when we got married, it was such a magnificent occasion because hometown weddings have a tendency to really bring communities together, and that's exactly what it felt like for us. We were both living in New York City. He was involved in the internet at its infancy, working with trailblazers like Walter Isaacson, which was really incredible. And I just happened to fall into public relations. We had some wonderful years together. In fact, our first apartment that we lived in was just steps from Central Park, and it was a 5th floor walk-up. So I want you to imagine a lot of stairs. You needed a tank of oxygen when you got to the top of the stairs. And in fact, I don't know if anybody ever saw the movie Barefoot in the Park, but it was like that. And it was very sweet. Life was very simple and fun. And, we had no kitchen, so I would bake apple pie on a patch of kitchen counter. And, these were really good years. And then one day, about 4 years into our married lives, Brett began to hiccup and burp. He had a really funny sense of humor, and he would joke about this until he couldn't stop. Well, one thing turned into another, and soon his symptoms really began to shift. We went to the internist, we went to the gastroenterologist because he was having stomach problems. And then, he was feeling really depressed and very worried. And I actually, as his loving wife, thought, well, he needs therapy. He's depressed. He has to, needs to talk to somebody about what was going on. And about that time, maybe a few weeks after he had started to see this therapist, things really took a dramatic turn, and he began to get dizzy and get headaches. And, he had lost a lot of weight. So I realized one night when I heard him throwing up in the middle of the night that something was really wrong. And I called that therapist back, and I just begged for help. I didn't know what to do. And thank goodness that therapist listened to me, because he called a colleague and a friend of his who was a neuro-oncologist at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital and explained my conversation. And she saw him the very next day, and they were able to make a diagnosis. So I'm going to read you just a very short section from both sides now about what happens in the neurosurgeon's office. But it really sets the stage for our conversation today. So this chapter is called Relief in the Plastic Brain. And the only thing you need to know is that in the book, I use the second person when Brett is still alive. So when you hear the word you, I'm speaking to him. You were so sick and tired that you almost welcomed the diagnosis. You were relieved to know that you weren't crazy. We saw the demon tumor ourselves in vivid contrast, tacked to the white fluorescent board in your surgeon's office. It was the size of a small rodent, a mouse or a dwarf rat. No sooner than Dr. Balmaceda break the news to us, life really did combust in that moment, than she escorted us upstairs to the 9th floor, where your young neurosurgeon-to-be, Dr. Michael Sisti, greeted us in his plush office. He had a kind face, a soft voice, and bright blue eyes. We stood looking at your brain scans as Dr. Sisti explained that the mass was lodged around the lower part of your cerebellum and down into your left medulla. We had no real knowledge of the inner workings of the human brain, how it is made up of over 100 billion nerve cells capable of 1,000 trillion connections, all happening in a squishy 3-pound lump the size of a cantaloupe. Neither one of us had ever seen an MRI of the brain before, and here was yours, black, white, and abnormal. What focused our attention was when Dr. Sisti raised the possibility that your tumor could be benign. You might not need chemotherapy or radiation at all if it's an ependymoma. Come sit, he said gently, sensing your physical exhaustion. I remember how you and I hung on those words. It could be benign. Dr. Sisti made no promises. The actual tumor would need to be confirmed by a pathology report after your surgery, which we scheduled with precision and haste for the following week. We sat in matching blue armchairs. You kept staring beyond the good doctor out the window at the Hudson River. You could not follow the conversation and had a pained look on your face. I was fixated on a pink, plastic, life-size model of a brain on his large mahogany desk, half listening as he told us about all the intricate cases he had operated on and how he would approach yours. Dr. Sisti tried to reassure us, even as he laid out multiple strategies for dealing with tumors in the posterior fossa, wherever that was. Again, he speculated on how the large size and location of your tumor were consistent with ependymomas. But if it's malignant, he said, that's another story. I started to take notes since the conversation was so surreal. As clear as lesion and fourth ventricle and cranioectomy and chemotherapy looked on paper, I felt disconnected from them, the pen a foreign object in my hand. Still, I forced myself to jot down the words, since I would never remember them otherwise. My foot fell asleep and I began to twist it awake. I felt an odd tension within my body, an airy, untethered wrestling. Part of me wanted to bolt from Dr. Sisti's office, to run from this dark curtain he was opening. I wanted to escape back in time, to unwritten scripts, not youth so much as possibility. The future with children and a house with a white fence, and you mowing the lawn and grilling on weekends, and me cooking vegetables grown from our garden. Life had turned for us in this moment, regardless of the outcome of your surgery. It might have been naive and vain to feel this way, that life would never cut us unexpectedly. No one, after all, deserves terrible things to happen. But really, we had been lucky up until now. I stayed in that blue chair in Dr. Sisti's office because at last there was some explanation for your declining health, and he appeared genuine and knowledgeable about how to help you. We spent an hour with him, and at some point he told us that he was likely the only neurosurgeon from New Jersey who neither played golf nor liked Bruce Springsteen. I'll forgive you, you said. Dr. Sisti weighed the variety of possible tumors and treatment protocols from good to moderate to bad. I hope, he wrote, that the treatments have the highest chance of success for this nice couple. Under normal circumstances, I'd have drilled down into every perceived scenario, but not this time. I kept looking at the brain on his desk, half expecting it to run and leap from the window into the Hudson River. Reality was shifting for me in this moment, and I couldn't understand why the plastic brain stayed static, or the desk hadn't budged. Why did the view of the river remain unobstructed? Why, when the earth had dropped the way it did for us, was nothing moving? So Brett did not have an ependymoma, as Dr. Sisti had hoped. He actually had a medulloblastoma, which is a tumor that typically affects children ages 5 and under. So after the surgery, because of where the tumor was situated, he had to learn to walk again, which was a very, very daunting thing for him. He had a very aggressive regimen of chemotherapy, including vincristine, which caused lasting neuropathy. He had 6 weeks of full craniosacral radiation that burned his incision, where they had done the original surgery so badly that it actually never healed. For the next few years, literally, it was leaking. And I can't remember at what point, it was a couple years later, when they had tried everything to heal the incision, he ended up having to have a vascular tissue transfer, where they took skin from his leg, It was a 16-hour procedure, but it worked. And then, after that year of treatment, everything sort of stabilized. We began to adapt to this new norm. He was feeling very good, very energetic. He honestly had missed very little work during this whole period of time. And over the next few years, we began to step out in life again and to feel as though maybe things were going to be okay. Because the thing is with medullas is that a good percentage of children live. I don't really know the statistics now, but a good percentage live. But it was very rare at that time for an adult to have a medulloblastoma. So not only did they not really have a set protocol for treating adults, but they didn't know what his outcome was going to be. So by this time, we were in our mid-30s. And of course, we were wanting to move on with our lives. And we always wanted to have a family. So this was an enormous decision to make on the heels of what had happened. And it was a decision that we did not make lightly. Brett's uncle, who we're very close with, is a pediatric oncologist. And at that point, he was the head of the hospital, the Lucile Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford University. And when we were talking to him about what should we do? Should we have children or not? He said, like a real scientist, the only proof of cure is life. So those were the words that gave us permission to explore this path. I had to go through in vitro fertilization because of his cancer. We used frozen sperm, and it was a pretty harrowing time. It took 3 times, but that 3rd time was a charm because that's when I got pregnant, and I learned that I was having twins. So at 30 weeks, I went into labor, which was not fun and not expected. And I am writhing on the table in deep labor. And I remember that a neonatologist came in to the room. Brett was sitting beside me and was so out of touch and out of sync with the scene. I don't know if anybody can ever relate to this, but having children born this early is a scary thing. But he made it 1,000 times scarier by the manner in which he was really reading off an entire list of things that could go wrong, from disability to death. He lacked so much compassion that I have never, ever forgotten that moment. So the babies were born and they're rushed into their incubators. They're okay. They're fine. They're just little. Rebecca was 2.5 pounds. Our son Casey was 3 pounds. Hours later, in the afternoon, same day, Brett and I were resting, catching a little snooze, lying together on my twin hospital bed. And Brett receives a call. It's his neuro-oncologist from Columbia Presbyterian saying that the routine MRI he had taken a few days prior, the one that was clean for 2 years, was back. And there was cancer everywhere. So medullas grow down the spine. So for the first time, he had a series of tumors down his spine also. So this was an absolute collision of life and death, right? I mean, how do you hold life and death in the exact same moment? Both sides now. So the twins stayed in the NIC unit at New York Presbyterian Cornell for about 6+ weeks, while Brett, meanwhile, was making the rounds at 3 other hospitals in the city. So his uncle, who was the one at Stanford, wanted his care to be moved actually to NYU, to the Hassenfeld Clinic, because they were the pediatric oncologists who had the most experience treating medullas. So he was getting ready for a double stem cell transplant, an Omeyer reservoir, and an entirely new creative cocktail of medicines. It held his cancer at bay for a year, but we already knew from his new neuro-oncologist that the chances of survival at this point were less than 5%. So flash forward one November night, 2003, he had a massive seizure and was out cold on our kitchen floor. Thankfully, my children were sleeping. It was about 9 o'clock at night, and they did not wake up to their mother screaming. A neighbor came to stay that night with the twins as I rode in the ambulance with Brett to Cabrini Hospice, which is in Lower Manhattan. His pediatric oncologist, Dr. Sharon Gardner, met us there and did something that was so extraordinarily gracious. over the next couple days because she could see how I was really struggling. And she made the decision for me that I really could not make for myself, which was that Brett really could not come home. So she said to me with such compassion and empathy, you know, things are only going to get worse from this point forward, and you really cannot risk having him have a seizure like this in front of the children. It's just too traumatic. So we transferred Brett to Calvary Hospice in the Bronx. His delirium was merciful at this point because he honestly thought he was home. He was really healthy from the neck down, but he died 12 years later. I have to tell you that 2 of his neuro-oncologists came to his funeral, and Dr. Balmaceda, his first neuro-oncologist from Columbia, she actually asked if she could speak at his funeral. What an extraordinary gesture to know how much Brett mattered to her. Those were very hard years and months of grief and mourning that followed, and I'm going to sort of synthesize the story a little bit now just in the interest of time, but it's in this book, the longer story. But in time, I realized that I needed to make a bold change, that I was sort of suffocating staying in New York. And I just needed something different, that I needed to leave the ghosts of illness and mourning that had become my life. Really, the whole of my 30s were spent caregiving and mourning. And I remember thinking, there has to be something more for me. That's how I ended up coming to Colorado. So I didn't just pick Denver out of a hat. My college roommate from Northwestern lives here, and every time I would visit her over the years, I just fell madly in love with the scenery. And I'm so glad I made the decision to come here 13 years ago, because I honestly have not looked back since. So this is the good part of the story now. About a year after I got here, a little less, I'm, stepping out in the world. I'm feeling bold. I'm feeling empowered in different ways, and that, taking a deep breath and feeling we're going to have a life here. And I happened to be reading the Rocky Mountain News, and they were promoting the fact that 5280 magazine was going to be coming out with their most eligible singles issue. And this year that Steve Saunders, longtime TV news anchor for the ABC affiliate, widower with 2 children whose wife had died of pancreatic cancer a couple years before, son of Dusty Saunders, he is like the it guy that year in Denver. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe we could be friends, because I don't really know anybody, in Denver other than my good friend I went to college with. So amid all crazy Hollywood odds, I sent him a letter and a photo, a really good photo. I have to I actually sent it twice because he didn't respond the first time. So you should always be bold. You never know what will happen. Because the first time, who's going to get mail at steve@5280singles.com, right? So I sent it to his work address the second time, which was a really good mood. So we, have been married over 11 years now. We've blended our families. Not easy. You've got 2 families, really, who were torn by loss. His boys were 10 and 11 when their mom died of pancreatic cancer, and those are hard ages. So just before Julie comes up, I just have to share this very brief letter that I received from Dr. Sisti, the neurosurgeon, who I read to you in this chapter, because he wrote me about the impact that plastic brain on his desk had on me. And I just love the self-awareness and the empathy that he showed, and, qualities that are so essential for you in the medical and caring professions. So he writes, everything came back in a flash when he read this. In an instant, I realized I had forgotten nothing about our first meeting and our subsequent struggles to fight Brett's cancer. And like you, I will never forget anything about it. The first visceral reaction I had after actually reading the chapter was my recollection that the entire weight of the world was on us that afternoon. I can still feel the pressure at this very moment. I never had any doubt it was as powerful to me as it was to the 2 of you at that time. The surreal and dislocating nature of the first contact with cancer never loses its potent sting. It's such a cruel disease to everyone it touches. Cancer may be relentless, but so are we. And even though there are no wins or losses, we struggle on, as I believe this is fundamental to the nature of our humanity, to fight for what's really important. Perhaps it's this terrible struggle that ultimately enables us to heal. By the way, that brain model is history. I grew tired of it sitting inertly on my desk. After a while, its plasticity seemed just so fake to me, especially when compared to the reality I know. I am now surprised it took me so long to spot the obvious from another person's perspective. But like all doctors, I still have a lot to learn. Dr. Michael Sisti, Professor of Clinical Neurosurgery, Radiation Oncology, and Otolaryngology at Columbia. So, Julie, thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Okay, good.
Okay, well, I feel like some of this is wordless. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to attempt to put some words to this, and then we will also open it up for comments or questions. I want to start perhaps with Dr. Sisti, and all illness experiences start with the sense of something's wrong. Something's wrong. And at first it was a joke, and then it wasn't a joke. Something's wrong. And it seems like a really, really important next piece to that was how you felt heard by the therapist who said yes and made the call. When you met with Dr. Sisti, you described that he was genuine and knowledgeable, but you also described beautifully how surreal that experience was. Was there anything different other than the pink plastic brain? Was there anything different that might have been helpful to you at that time from him?
Rather than me having to take notes, I've often thought about this. I wonder, in a situation like that, where you're so devastated, your world has turned upside down, I wonder if there could be a team member who could take notes. Because it's like you're trying to listen, you're trying to look and engage and connect, and I'm worried about my husband, and I'm trying to take notes, and these are long words, some of them, it was a lot. It was a lot at once. Yeah, but he just was so patient.
And was communicated a lot of empathy and understanding was...
He really did, and he was about our age, I think, which helped. I think it was a shock. He could see it. Yeah. He was just, you always hear these stories sometimes of the sterile doctor's rooms. This was not like that. This was just, it was nice to be in an office that had sort of a dark blue rug and a dark wooden desk, and there wasn't harsh lighting. And all of those things, I think, just softened the conversation. But he just spent a lot of time with us.
Which sort of brings me to my next question about the other kind of experience you had with the neonatologist. Yeah. I think it was a neonatologist. Yeah. And, when you have such an incredible, and the phrase you use, I think, is really apt, which is the collision of life and death, a different play on the sense of both sides now. You had both sides now of caregiver responses or ways of dealing with you. What happened with the neonatologist?
I never saw him again, thank goodness, because I think I might have slugged him. I honestly, I wanted him to leave so badly. It was so terrible. I don't know the protocol, but I'm sure he had to, by law, do that. I really don't even know. But all I can tell you is that from a pure human level, he was so out of touch with what was happening in that moment. It's not even that he needed to know our back history, that Brett had had cancer. Irrespective of that, he was completely insensitive to, what was going on in that moment. And his delivery was cold. It was impersonal. Yeah, I think he was like literally reading. I remember some papers. And then, I heard him because it was just, you had to hear him. And I can't remember even if we had to sign papers. I don't remember. It was a lot. It was traumatic.
You've been in touch with a number of the different caregivers,
Yes.
like while you were writing the book.
I did. I went back.
So
yes.
forth. Did you ever connect with him at all, or did you say
no?
Not going.
I don't even remember, isn't it now? But I did go back to the the NIC unit, and I saw several of the nurses there, and they had remembered, some of them, the story, just because have everything happen on one day like that, right? To become a mother, and then to basically learn that I'm going to be widowed. I mean, this is really just a matter of time. I was kind of a wreck. I was kind of a wreck in the neonatal unit a lot of the time, and it was just hard to keep it together, and they were amazingly empathetic. I think it was a little unusual, probably.
Yeah, I would say so. So with the folks at the hospice, you mentioned the one hospice doctor who said she went ahead and just took a decision out of your...
Well, she wasn't a hospice doctor. She was his pediatric oncologist. Okay. Right. And she basically said at Cabrini Hospice, which was, it was short-term hospice. So she said, he can't come home. At that point, we had home hospice, but he needed to be in the hospital after this big seizure. And so Cabrini wouldn't take patients then, at least for a long period of time. And so she just could see the evolution, what was happening, and it was too traumatic. I remember that conversation also like it was yesterday, because it's a terrible thing, terrible decision to have to make, but it was the right decision.
But helpful to you at that point that she went ahead and made the decision.
It was enormously helpful to me. I think I would have felt guilty making the decision by myself, but having it taken out of my hands by someone with experience and someone who had such empathy really helped a lot. So, and hospice is wonderful. This was wonderful. Calvary Hospice was great. I would bring my twins a lot, and they would run around and jump on the bed. They didn't really understand what was happening, which in some ways was a blessing. Later on, as you know, and some of you know in this room, they grew up without really knowing, who their dad was. And those memories they don't really have any memories. That's why I wrote this children's book, Because the Sky is Everywhere. So,
can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So what happened is, I didn't bring the twins to Brett's funeral because they were 2.5 years old. My son was really struggling a lot in particular. They had preemie stuff, clearly, because they were so undercooked, but he was also exhibiting tremendous signs of grief. He was walking on his toes, he was banging into things, he needed a lot of input and impact. I was taking him to this psychiatrist downtown who specialized in working with children with grief. And he said, just do a drive-by of a cemetery. Just put it out there and see what happens. So we were going to visit my parents in Connecticut, and there's an old cemetery. And I'm in my minivan, and I said, oh, look, guys, there's a cemetery. And Rebecca had a really high, squeaky voice, and she said, oh, is that where Daddy is? They were 3 years old. This was like maybe 6 months after Brett had died. And Casey said, no, Rebecca, Daddy is in the sky. And so I remember gripping the steering wheel thinking, where on earth did he come up with that language? Because, we never really talked in those terms. So Rebecca said, Mommy, is the sky back that way? Meaning New York City, where we lived at the time. And Casey said, no, Rebecca, the sky is everywhere. And I remember thinking, wow, that's amazing, because they just figured something out all on their own, that he is not physically here anymore, but his love is everywhere. And that was huge. That was a huge moment.
Hence the book.
Yeah.
So you also have two questions. One, maybe I'll start with this first one, which has to do with sort of learning to live with uncertainty and ambiguity as much as certainty and black and white, and I just want to know what things are. which is nice for any of us, but most of the time we have to settle for ambiguity and uncertainty.
The gray.
What has helped you most be able to live with all that kind of uncertainty?
Well, it's interesting because, again, it goes back to the song and it goes back to the metaphor of both sides now. Because what I realized from my experience is that things would never, ever, ever be certain or black and white or absolute again, that they were always going to be gray. And if I could learn to be in that space of gray, which is nuanced and forgiving and flexible, and that I was going to be okay, because I realized things were probably never ever going to feel incredibly like perfect or totally joyful or again, but maybe they also wouldn't ever be this terrible. And so if I could just live my life in the in-between, that's what really has helped me the most. It's still the way I approach my life today. And my life has taken different turns because I've made that happen. But I think it's a very powerful lesson about just being in the gray of life and knowing that gray is more than okay. It's actually a pretty great spot to be in. I think it's personally the place where boldness and where risk-taking and where creativity are born.
Well, clearly you've been able to make it that way, and which is phenomenal. I'm curious about the people around you. And this was at my second question, having to do with support and empathy. Clearly this took a huge number of folks to get through the whole experience, including the hospice time.
Right.
But even since, and whether or not others have been able to, Brett's family, for instance, perhaps his
we're
parents.
Very, very close, right.
Of how have they been able to be as resilient as you in this?
Yeah, it's interesting because denial and illness comes up a lot. I'm sure many of you have experienced that. And I had some conflict with my mother-in-law, who was the nicest person you will ever meet in your life. But, when Brett was alive and very sick, she was just so flustered, and she's still like this a little bit today. She can't go there. And so I would hear 5% or I would hear something horrible, and she wouldn't hear it at all. And she would be looking at everything through rose-colored glasses. That was not helpful to me, I have to be honest. But then I really later, and it took time for me to understand that you go where you need to go, right? And so I've experienced sort of everybody copes differently. People have helped and supported in so many different ways. It's very hard to be able to articulate what you need when you're living amid a long-term crisis situation. There were days I felt I really couldn't mother at all, and somebody just had to take my kids because I just couldn't do it. And there were other days I thought, okay, but healing takes time, right? It's taken me a long time to see. And writing this book, the first book, Both Sides Now, a lot of people ask me, well, was it very therapeutic for you? It was definitely not therapeutic for me. I did not write it at a point where I needed therapy. I wrote it at a point where I had distilled enough of my experience that I could integrate this messy 10 years and I could make sense of it. And that was incredibly healing.
Yeah, you did. I was just curious to even at the hospice, were folks, did you have the space that you needed for that, or were you surrounded by people who were just intuitively supportive and helpful to you?
Well, it was interesting because the hospice physician at Calvary, I'll never forget this one. He came and he met us. His name, it's in the book, Papanudas, a Greek name, something. He was a young guy. He started to cry. I thought that was very unusual because how many cases must he see as a hospice physician? He started to cry because I think he saw himself in Brett. He was young. And that was interesting. That actually was okay. Sometimes when people were very upset around us, you don't want to take care of someone else's grief, but that was okay, what happened? You know, the space to grieve, the space to, it was hard. You know, I mean, it was hard every time my kids came. It was hard. I'd never experienced death up close like that, never. But as you know, his death was really beautiful. It was unexpectedly beautiful because people just showed up. They weren't invited. It's not like we were having a party or anything, but people just showed up. Cousins, neighbors, friends. It was like, you never in a million years would I have planned his death that way. But I am certain he would not have wanted me to be alone. And that's grace.
A
good segue, Q&A. Oh, he wants to.
Right. So we'll go ahead. I was going to say I've heard your story multiple times in conversation.
Well, we're friends too.
And
so.
right. And I'm always really quite speechless in response to it. The first time I heard it, we were skiing together and we were riding up a chairlift, and we stood at the top of the chairlift for over an hour, never made a single run, just talking through this and you relating your story. And it was not long after you had moved out here.
Right.
So kids were young. So with that though, questions, comments? Yes.
Could you use your microphone? Can you get to a microphone and anywhere? But somebody needs to hold the button down for you.
Thank you for your presentation. My father died of a brain tumor when I was 6 years old. I won't trouble you with the details of how primitive neuroimaging was in 1959. But a researcher wrote a book about 30 years ago based on her interviews with 60 or 70 adults who had lost a parent as a child. The title of her book was The Loss That Is Forever. And in the first chapter, she says in straining to try to find an analogy or an image that would convey the depth of that loss, she could only come up with the Holocaust and with nuclear winter, following Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so I wonder if you would speak more about how you guided your children who lost their father at such a young age through this, how you tried to perpetuate his memory and what their experience was.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. So because my children were born so early, living in New York City also, they threw early intervention specialists at you. We had a revolving door of physical therapists, occupational therapists, sensory people, and also a social worker. And it was the social worker who was also a play therapist who was unbelievably helpful in guiding me with the real-time events of what was happening. I did not have the experience or the words. So what she did, and I'm sorry that I didn't bring this now, you made me think I need to do this the next time. She would draw these black and white images on just big paper. Here is Daddy going to the doctor, right? Here is Daddy, in a coffin later. Here is Nana crying, and I mean, they were so little, and they used to hang on these things like gold. And I still save them. That was incredibly helpful. It takes a lot. I would never have known how to do that. But the loss is forever. The loss is forever, and the loss changes, and the relationship to the loss changes. You feel it at every milestone, the start of the new school year. You feel it on birthdays. You feel it everywhere and always. And, people cope very differently. My daughter has been much slower to process the loss than her twin brother was. It's forever. That answer? It's still ongoing. I mean, there's no balm for the loss. There's no, and even with, I will say, a wonderful stepdad who has really been in their lives now longer than their biological father ever was, that loss is still there. Well, a few years, not by much.
Right. I found it very helpful many years later with the help of an excellent therapist. I just experienced it as a loss, but he helped me see how close my connection to my father was through pictures.
Oh,
and
right.
and then I was able to transform that into understanding that I really did have that connection, and I really did have a dad, and it wasn't simply loss.
That's lovely. Well, we have pictures, we have videos, I tell stories. We're very close with Brett's family, very, very close. And that helps a lot because his love is everywhere still.
I think that's really helpful because in 1959, the technique was to put away all the pictures and pretend it didn't happen. But we've evolved. Yeah.
Goodness.
Yeah. Thank you.
If I might just mention, Mitch Albom's interviews with Maury.
Tuesdays with Maury.
David
Right.
Maury, he talks about, even as an older man, the death of his mother, and still cries about it. That always, even though he holds her internally, which one, essentially does, but how that just kind of goes through life with you always.
Thanks a lot for sharing a very difficult part of your life with us. It's very moving. I presume you've read the book Being Mortal by Atul Gawande.
I have. I loved it.
And you found it paralleled your experience pretty much?
Not really, I don't think. In what ways?
As I recall in his book, he is somewhat critical of the training that physicians receive for dealing with patients and with patients' families in end-of-life issues, and that the focus is on the science, not the human connection so much. And my question leads to, what changes has CU Med School made as a result of his, if you will, intervention, his knowledgeable analysis of that? And I see a few gray-haired guys around here besides
That's not a question
me.
I can answer, but Tess or anybody who has more experience?
Well, sure, I can speak a little bit to this. And I can speak I think I can speak most, perhaps, concretely to the School of Medicine. And so the Center for Bioethics and Humanities has upwards of 80 hours with students around issues, whether it's humanistic practice, whether it's ethical issues, including end of life. And so this is longitudinal across the 4 years. And so I do think that we've made a concerted, and I hope really creative as well as compassionate effort to work against some of that lack of training that Gawande speaks of. And, I think about that book, and I actually use that book with students in the courses I teach in literature and medicine. And the thing that brings Gawande to that book is the loss of his own father. Exactly. But one of the most telling, I think, moments in that book is when the young woman who has a child, a new baby, and a terminal diagnosis, and he can't bring himself to say, yeah, we don't really need to, do surgery on that tumor, that's because you're dying of lung cancer, but he cannot do it. And the very fact that he talks about why he cannot do it, I think is one of the crucial lessons of that book for our students.
Your story speaks to me very personally. I want to thank you also for sharing it. I had the loss of a 3-pound, 3-ounce infant after the worst possible experience with an anesthesiology in New York. And it was the third major loss in 2 years. And I'd had yet another, my mother years before, my dad, my boyfriend, and then my daughter. And I can so relate to that sense of that, pardon me, it still makes me emotional, that idiot anesthesiologist and the way she spoke to me about what was going to happen. And the way the hospital handled the whole thing was outrageous. They told me not to go see the baby because they said I might have an infection. So I didn't go see her until she was dying. She was perfectly fine up till, she lived 2.5 days. And they told my now ex-husband that there was something wrong with me for not going to see her, which came out 10 years later. He thought I was a bad mother. And I wanted nothing more than to see her. So it's just so amazing to me how these things can happen. And I was young, and I can certainly relate to the 5-floor walk-up. But I didn't know how to speak up as a patient. I didn't feel empowered. I loved my doctor. I didn't want to say, we didn't sue the hospital. We didn't feel they handled the whole thing well, but we didn't sue because we're not litigious, and we also felt that our doctor had done his best and all the right things that he could have done. So they sued me later for non-payment on top of everything. So these things happen, and I'm just telling this as corroboration, kind of. And I've had years to heal, and I'm so grateful for the people in my life, the books that have been written, people who are brave enough to share their stories, because this is very real and it still happens. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry for your loss. Oh.
How old are the twins now?
Oh, they're 18.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, they're seniors in high school. It's a very stressful time, I have to say. They're like night and day. You can't even believe they shared a gene pool, quite frankly, because she is like on her game, self-directed, on the ball, and he's like, it's optional. I'll do it later.
So I'm wondering, many 2-year-olds in the past, without all the technology to bring back the videos and all
Right.
of that, it's very hard for them to remember some of those things, unless some of the traumatic
they can't really
things.
Remember.
Right. So at the age of 18, how often do they speak of him, or, how present is that in their lives today?
It's not especially present, and that makes me sad, but that also necessitates why he has to just be a part of the everyday conversation. They don't really, he's present through his family, right? Because Nana, his mother, we're very close with, his sister, we're very close with. And so he's present, or I'll make a comment about maybe something I'll cook and he'll be present in that way, but it's hard. I would say it's interesting the way things shift too, because my son really does not like to go there at all. And I think he's a teenage boy. And what I have been told by people who, I have occasionally participated in a grief networking alliance, which is a wonderful group of hospice and palliative care people throughout the Denver metro area. And people there have said, he's going to come back. He's going to come back in his 20s. It makes me sad because I think the loss is just right beneath the surface a lot of the time. And I sometimes think it would be easier for him in particular if he could just go to that well and touch it a little bit. But it's hard. It's just hard.
And is that family still in Connecticut?
Yeah, everybody. And my parents, everybody is there.
So they see them frequently?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Nancy, we're out of time.
Okay.
But I want to thank both you and Julie for spending time with us Thank you, Nancy, for sharing your story. And I want to invite everyone to stay for a few minutes if Nancy has a little extra time to talk, and certainly to consider picking up one of the books. Julie, any last words?
Yes.
Yeah.
What I was sitting here thinking about is one of my favorite novels is Wallace Stegner's Angle of Repose. And for those of you who have read that, it's about a woman who is sort of along with her minor husband, and they settle in Leadville. And she is simply seeking an angle of repose in her life. That doesn't mean that things are black and white. It means that there is hardship and ambiguity and uncertainty. And perhaps that's the angle of repose that we're all talking about today.
So much. Thank you for that. Thanks, everybody.